Welcome to Tourism Talk. I'm Laura Oswald, Director of Marketing at the Paducah Convention and Visitors Bureau. One Book Read is an annual community tradition that draws together students here on the campus of West Kentucky Community and Technical College with locals of all walks of life throughout the community, all around the art of literature. This program has welcomed many nationally renowned authors over the years, and this year we have the great opportunity to not only welcome a nationally known author, but a Kentucky author. Crystal Wilkinson, author of Water Street, welcome to Tourism Talk and to Paducah.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. We follow your work from afar, your work and teaching in Central Kentucky. We are so glad to have you as a teacher and as an author here in Paducah for One Book Read. What is the importance of conversations like this and programs like this that bring us together around the written word?
Well, I mean, I think that any community, we have lots of issues that we could talk about, and I think that literature facilitates necessary conversations. So the ways in which, there's several conversations going on. When someone reads a book, they're having sort of a private conversation with whatever's going on, it's sort of a mental conversation. And then if there's a group that sits and talks, a lot of people have book groups, then that creates a larger conversation and things will come up that someone hadn't thought about saying. And then if it even gets larger to a community, I think it affords the citizens a chance to talk about the themes in the work, but they also address concerns that may be going on in their own communities.
Sure.
So I think that it's important because literature is a way for us to have conversations about things that we may be uncomfortable with just sipping tea or having a Coke and talking about.
Right.
So I think that literature affords us a way to sort of examine the lives that we lead. I've always thought that it's a writer's responsibility to tell the truths of our times. And so if I, as a writer, am doing that, then readers and people who discuss books are having conversations about the issues of our time.
Absolutely. And Water Street really seems, as you talk there, seems a perfect vehicle to have that conversation and your experience and your writings about Kentucky. Tell us a little bit about Water Street for those viewers who have not yet dove into the book.
So Water Street is a short story cycle of 13 stories. And as the title indicates, it's all the characters live on this one street. I often hear people talk about if they're sort of have a literary reference of Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio. It's sort of like Winesburg, Ohio, set in Kentucky in an African-American contemporary setting. So all the characters know one another. They all live on the same street. They have usually two stories to tell, and one of them is sort of the story that's going on that everybody knows about in the community, the kind that they present to the community. And then the other story that's going on is one that they, sort of the secrets they keep and the things that they keep to themselves. So it's an inside look at those members in this particular community, and a character who's secondary in a story may appear as the primary character in the next story.
Right. We can all, in a small community here in Paducah, we can definitely feel that connection, and I think that this will be such a great conversation for us this evening. And while you're here, not only are you doing this great public presentation, which will bring the community together, you're working with students with writing workshops. How does that play in? Does that really focus directly on Water Street and their experience of reading that book? What do those workshops look like?
Well, I'm looking forward to doing a lot of exercises. My focus with the students is not, if they want to talk about my work, they can, but what I'm excited about working with them is getting them to think about their own work. Yeah. So if they have read my book, or even if they haven't, sort of what they can tap into. So there's another conversation to be had, and trying to get those students to tap into the stories, the truth of their time.
Sure. I found a quote online of when you had spoken at Creative Mornings in Lexington, and it said, "The base of every good story is what if." And that seems like such an empowering phrase, and I imagine that that would play in to your conversations with the students and that engagement.
Absolutely. You know, what if is the basis of writing a story or even telling a story.
Yeah.
You know, what if this happened or what if that happened? And, you know, if this happens instead of that, you know, how does that
Right.
affect the character, which in real life, how does that affect the person?
Right.
You know, in even thinking about your own stories, if you're not a writer, if you're storytelling, or if you're retelling a story that's always been told in your family, I mean, it helps you with your own choices. Like, you know, my grandmother only had a third grade education, but what if women were afforded the opportunity to go to college in my small town? Or what if my own African American grandmother had been able to become a teacher? She wanted to become a teacher. So how did that affect me? I became a teacher. You know, I became a professor because, in many ways, because my grandmother wasn't able to. So even that is a what if.
Absolutely. And that, I think that obviously inspires creativity. And being a creative city here in Paducah, we want to inspire all locals to think about their role as creative people. You know, creativity is something we all have within,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
So,
Yeah, whether you choose to write or not, and it comes in other art forms, and it comes as being a human being every day, being creative in your everyday life too.
yes. Well, I think back to participating. I mentioned we have some mutual friends in the Central Kentucky area that I met through the Kentucky Rural Urban Exchange. And one of the great exercises we did through that was identifying different roles you play within your community. And I recall we got toward the end of this exercise and storyteller came up. And everyone identified as that. You know, I think being a Kentuckian, that those words go together in a sense.
Right. I mean, so many of us grew up with that. Right. You know, I always, when I'm talking to people from other places across the country, some of them don't have the same experience that we have, but you and I know, and the citizens of Paducah know, that whenever you were in trouble, you know it wasn't going to be fast. If there wasn't some kind of corporal punishment, you knew that you had to sit and listen to this story. And many times, like when I was in trouble, it was like my grandmother would tell me something that happened when she was a child, and you know, and that was ingrained. And then I passed those stories on to my children, which had nothing to do with writing, but had to do with being a part of this rich culture of storytelling.
And obviously, those Kentucky roots really have shaped you and inspired you. Will you talk a little bit about that and how those roots have played into your writing?
Well, one way that it's played into my writing is my affection for the land itself. I grew up on a farm with my grandparents, and the land. My grandfather worked the land. He was a tobacco farmer. He raised cows. We had some pigs. Anything that was a connection to nature, we did. We picked hickory nuts. We picked blackberries. My grandmother canned. So all of those sort of things come back up in my writing too. The great writer Ernest Gaines said that whenever he envisioned a character in a kitchen, that he envisioned his aunts working in the kitchen on the plantation that they worked on in Louisiana. So for me, whenever I envision a creek or a tree, it starts with a Kentucky tree and a Kentucky creek before I begin to layer on fiction. So nature's a big part. Sort of the art of storytelling is a big part that connects me to Kentucky. The way that our speech, the way that we talk, those kind of colloquialisms and old-fashioned sayings, all of that plays a role into my and sort of enhancing that. You know, sometimes I think as Kentuckians we grow up thinking that we're less than, So especially and our accents get made fun of when we go to college or we go outside of the state. So I think I highlight those things in a positive way in my work, and sort of reclaim
Sure.
our heritage.
Right, empowering people to kind of own that, own
Absolutely.
their story.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. And you say Kentuckians less than. You certainly have been a great representation for Kentucky and won many awards, including Southerner of the Year most recently. Are there particular awards or recognitions that you've received that have been most meaningful to you?
Well, I think that was a big one, being Southerner of the Year. And I think when my third book, The Birds of Opulence, came out, I felt like that was the best of both worlds. When I won Appalachian Book of the Year, and then I won the Ernest Gaines Award, which was for African American literature, sort of one of the African American literature books of the year. And so the two of those, I felt like this is who I am.
Yeah.
And those two awards sort of were the epitome of exactly who I am and what I'm trying to do as a writer. So those were probably my favorites. Not that I loved all the other awards too, but the coming together of those two was very special for me.
And recognizing what you know to be true for you. That's so wonderful.
Absolutely.
Well, we've got to give a shout out. Being a creative city here in Paducah, we have connections to some other really great creative cities in the United States, including Iowa City. And I know that you have some connections to the International Creative Writing Center there. Will you talk about your experiences with Iowa City and what that looks like?
Well, when I was there, I went to the International Conference of the Short Story, which is worldwide, and they happened to hold it there. And I loved being in Iowa City and getting to know the people there, and to have people from all over the world come there to talk about the short story and how important it is to world literature and to world understanding.
Right. And I think that's what we hope people will see about the whole Creative Cities Network, is that sense of community and sense of celebrating American culture, but also the connection that has globally and the significance that has. And I think there's value obviously on the literary side and quilting here in Paducah, and far beyond that. What do you see creativity? How do you see that as something that plays into our communities and storytelling, but in other ways? How do you see that in Kentucky here, that is part of our fabric and a valuable part of our fabric?
Well, I think all of the arts and crafts that we do, I think one of the reasons why I'm a creative person is because I was raised in a creative household. My grandmother quilted. My grandfather carved what we called then play pretties out of pieces of wood. My grandmother wrote, and she wasn't writing for publication like I do. She was writing songs on the backs of envelopes. We were a singing family, certainly not professionally, but singing was a big part of church and a big part of being a community. I think just about every kind of art form that you could think of was part of it. But then, like I said, the sort of the act of creativity being a part of your everyday. My grandmother sewed, and of course that was something that a lot of women did during her time, but it was also, I think, a way to sort of soothe her mind. It was a way to be communal when she and the other women who lived up the holler where we live would get together, and they would talk about issues in the community. They'd solve problems with a young child for a young mother who wasn't sure what she was doing. They would solve some financial issue in the church, and that sort of extended out. So I think that even in business and in corporate worlds, that there's a need for creativity.
Yes, and now with that seems to play into your role now as an educator and educating the next generation of Kentuckians, of citizens, to really live and move our communities forward. I know that one of the one of the things that we mentioned is some of the conversations that need to be had. Is that, thinking about the educational space and what that looks like, writing, empowering your students that are studying writing, how are you encouraging them to be those leaders that we need to move us forward?
Well, I think that, it sounds simplistic, but even if you're not going to become a writer, like I teach a lot of students at University of Kentucky who are not going to become writers. They take writing because they need the grade and they want to get an arts perspective. But I think reading is probably just as important, if not more important, because it does connect you with someone other than yourself. It connects you to experiences that are not your own. It connects you to settings, to towns, to cities, to other countries, other worlds that you don't experience. And so by doing that and connecting with someone else's creativity, you're also connecting with someone's reality and able to think outside yourself. And I think once you're able to think outside yourself, that creates empathy. And once you have empathy, your life begins to shift a little bit. So you can, even though you haven't experienced it, understand homelessness and begin to empathize. You can begin to understand mental illness, even though you may not have experienced it. You can understand racial divides or cultural divides, and just sort of a wealth of other things. If you grew up in the city, you can begin to see the value of nature.
Yes.
If you grew up in a rural space, you can begin to understand an urban space. So I think reading opens up an entire world. And if you begin to read as a critical thinker and not just read for a grade or feel like you're being forced into it, of course that's what I do, but I just think it opens up so many avenues for people.
Yeah, and I think that for us is why this One Book Read program is such a special program for our community, and bringing people of all walks of life together within National Reading Month to really celebrate what the power of those words can be. And like I said, we're just so excited you're here for this. What typically, for those who may not be able to attend your talk, what are your talks? Give us a little preview of what that might look like.
Well, one of the things I'm going to talk about this evening and tomorrow as well is sort of my experience as an individual before I became a writer, and kind of growing up in a rural environment and being among the first in my family to ever go to college. My grandmother had an 8th grade education. My grandfather had a 3rd grade education. My mother only went through high school. So I'll talk about some of that and how that influenced me, and then I'll probably share a little bit from one of my books, probably Water Street, and talk a little bit about how I came to formulate those stories and what they mean to me. Yes. And then I hope to engage in conversation with people. I really enjoy having a dialogue.
Well, I know, like we mentioned, having that personal experience reading, then maybe discussing with a group of friends, and then you have this larger discussion. There are a lot of book clubs that come to this event each year and make this one of their annual picks. So that seems like a great opportunity to connect, and I'm sure that there will be some great questions that come into the larger view because
I'm
of that.
excited. There's nothing like having, even when I walk into a classroom, if someone invites me to a classroom, to have, 20 people who've read the book, or I go to a lot of book clubs, or I Skype with book clubs, and to have a book club that's read it, but to have an entire community and have so many people who've read it, who've discussed it, without my presence, and then to be present and to hear some of their questions or their concerns or their conversations with each other. It's very, very exciting.
I would imagine there are some interesting takeaways and perspectives that your readers bring to this type of discussion. Are there any that kind of stand out as themes or things that people really draw from your writing?
Well, one of the things that continues to surprise me, it always surprises me, even though people have said this for a long time, is when, you know, obviously I'm an African American, obviously I'm a woman. I don't know, I still have an accent, so probably people can figure out that I'm from the foothills of Appalachia, maybe, with my twang. But what always amazes me is when someone says, I could see myself, or I could see my grandmother, or I saw my sister in this story, or what this reminded me of was this. And the way that people take that sort of specificity that happens in the story and extend it out to their own family or extend it out to themselves, and that crosses barriers of race, it crosses barriers of class, it crosses barriers of culture and place, and that's the most exciting thing that I see happening.
Absolutely. I hope that there will be some of those experiences for you while you're here in Paducah and those connections. Before we go any further, I'd love for you to share with our readers where they can learn a little bit more and perhaps purchase some of your writing.
Any bookstore, I always encourage people that if your library, you know, ask your library to order it if it's not there. Any bookstore can order it for you if it's not on their shelves. And to find out more information about me, I have a website at it's crystalewilkinson.net.
Great.
And yeah.
Yeah, well, we definitely encourage our readers, or readers also, to check that out. You mentioned bookstores. I know that you have connection to being a bookstore owner, and really do see value in that, that type of a business. Some people may think Amazon is pushing that kind of thing out, but that personal experience, that in market, you know, that locally owned bookstore, that can't be something that goes away. Tell our viewers a little bit about your perspective on that. Yeah,
me and my husband owned a bookstore for 8 years. We just sold it at the end of September. But it's been an amazing experience, and that's another way of having conversations and connecting to readers and to people. And we were a bookstore, but we were also sort of a gathering place. So people would come for readings, but they would also have public conversations. And I think that your local bookstore is one of those places. We had a coffee house, and I think it's just an ideal place for people to have conversations that they might not normally have, to see people that they might not normally see, and just to engage with each other around books or around a cup of coffee. And I think that we have to support those locally. And it just lightens my heart to think about local bookstores. You know, every city or town needs one. And as I travel, that's what I always wish for. I'm like, oh, they need a bookstore here. And of course, I can't open them all across the country, but I'll plant that seed when I'm somewhere. You all really need a local bookstore. And it's just a wonderful tool. It really is a tool and a resource for the community.
And in addition to bookstores, we have some great reading series that happen here in Paducah, and we certainly encourage our viewers to not only be part of One Book Read and what happens at our McCracken County Library, which is so fabulous, but also these reading series, and any chance that you're able to connect around stories.
Absolutely.
It's a great opportunity.
And to seek those things out. Yes. Like if you come to One Book Read once a year, then seek out some opportunity every month.
Take it to the next level. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, as far as defining Kentucky's literary culture, I know that you have connections across the state within that world and have taught in many different institutions. How would you define Kentucky's literary culture for those viewers that may be into reading, but maybe there's an opportunity for them to get more into Kentucky writing?
I think that in our state, particularly in the Bluegrass state, there's no excuse. In other states, there are excuses where people say, well, I don't know, we don't have that many writers or whatever, but not in Kentucky. We are very fortunate and we are very rich. Our literary legacy is phenomenal. And I mean, you could start a list of reading Kentucky writers and be on that list for a while. And I encourage people to do that. I encourage the book clubs to bring in at least one Kentucky author during their cycles when they're reading books. Everybody from, going back to Harriet Arnott, James Steele, Gurney Norman, James Baker Hall, Wendell Berry, Gail Jones. It sort of goes on and on. There's a rich legacy. And I mean, I don't encourage my students to do this when they're writing research papers, but I encourage everyone else to get on Google and look up some of those names and just start. And don't just start at this end with like me and Silas House. Go back and start with Robert Penn Warren or Harriet Arnott and start with those and pick one from that end. Some of the Kentucky classics, there are lots of them, and then pick someone on the early end. And there's something for everyone on that list. There's fiction, there's nonfiction. Robert Gipe is writing some really wonderful graphic novels where he's illustrated them, and the stories are so rich and pure Eastern Kentucky voices. There's so many people who are writing.
Those are all wonderful suggestions. And before we have to go, I'd love to ask you if there's one thought that you'd like to leave Paducah with.
Well, one, I want to be gracious and say thank you to Paducah for reading my work. And that would be my suggestion for Paducah, is to continue to investigate Kentucky writing and pass that on to our children so that Kentucky children know that we have a rich legacy here in Kentucky, a rich literary legacy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, Crystal, and for being here in Paducah and sharing your wonderful work.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching Tourism Talk. Check out crystalewilkinson.net. Visit paducah.travel and our calendar of events for upcoming literary events, lectures, talks, readings, and many of those experiences that you can have of Kentucky culture here in Paducah. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.
1, 2, 1, 2, go. Hello, ba-ba-da-ba-ba. Ba-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da. Hello, ba-ba-da-ba-ba. Ba-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. Ba-ba-da-ba-ba. Ba-ba-da-ba-ba.